Hello, my name's Amy, and today we're going to be talking about all the books I read this spring. It is absolutely ages since I filmed any kind of reading wrap-up, so we have got loads of books to get through. And this is despite the fact that in the middle of the spring I kind of stopped reading for a while. The last 18 months or so have been so strange that I think a lot of us have gone through some version of this, where even if we had time, reading wasn't really something we had the brain power for. But I started off the year reading quite a lot, and I've been reading quite a lot over the last couple of months, so we've got loads of books to get through. Let's get started. We are starting with Jade City by Fonda. This is a book I finished right at the end of January. This is a kind of urban fantasy set in a modern day version of an Asian city. It's heavily influenced by Hong Kong gangster films. When this first started getting a lot of buzz soon after its release, there was a lot of talk about it being Fonda Lee's debut. Now, strictly speaking, that's not true. It is her adult fantasy debut, but she's written other books before and it really shows. This is such a slick book from start to finish. The writing is great, the pacing is great, the plot is pretty tight from start to finish. The characters particularly are people that you wouldn't really want to meet in real life, and they're often doing horrible things, and yet they feel very real, and you can't help but feel sympathy for them even if you don't always like them. And despite the setting being completely fictional, you absolutely get a sense that it could be real. There are lots of politics, both internal in the city and international, going on behind the scenes. Some are covered in more details than others, but they feel completely real, and I think they're also going to be explored more in the rest of the trilogy. If you like gritty, modern urban fantasy and you've got a bit fed up with vampires and werewolves, I would highly recommend this one to you. The same goes for if you enjoy gangster films or martial arts films. There is a lot here to enjoy. It's a very strong book, and I have heard that book 2 is even better. The next book I finished was Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this one. If you are at all interested in classics and Austen, you have probably read this or seen some TV or film version of it. It was Austen's first published work, and what I found really interesting is parts of it felt like a prototype for later books. I did enjoy it, but it's not my favourite Austen work. The characters don't have quite as much personality as characters in her later books. And the two key romantic relationships in the book between the Dashwood sisters and their partners never completely felt true to me. Eleanor's relationship almost seems fully formed at the start of the book and then doesn't get a lot of airtime throughout the rest, and it was hard for me to really root for Marianne's relationship. There was a certain sense that she was getting married to someone who was going to be good for her. Now, of course, it's very true to the time period, and we're supposed to definitely feel happy for Eleanor and Marianne by the end, but there's a big contrast here between, say, Pride and Prejudice and this book. In Pride and Prejudice, you absolutely want Elizabeth and Darcy to get together. You feel from the beginning that they are so right for each other, despite all the things standing in their way. I never exactly got that feeling with Sense and Sensibility. So it's worth reading if you're an Austen fan, but it's not my favourite of her works. Next up, we're back to the fantasy with The Hero of Ages by Sanderson. Now, I've covered this one quite extensively in a reading vlog I did back in, I think, March, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I had mixed feelings about this one. I know Sanderson is kind of worshipped in fantasy circles, as though he can do no wrong. And I did enjoy the Mistborn trilogy overall, but this was probably my least favourite of the three. The best thing about The Hero of Ages was very much the way that every little plot point from the entire trilogy came together and was wrapped up by the end. I cannot fathom the amount of planning that went into this series. Having said that, I find the world, particularly in this third book, very drab, which was something I talked about in that vlog. And I felt like a lot of the plot of this third book was a little bit flat for me. The same goes for Vin and Elend, which is something I've seen in other reviews. They're supposedly in a committed relationship by this third book, but I just did not feel it. Their interactions to me felt like vague acquaintances. I liked them as individual characters very much, but I just really never felt any emotion between the two of them. Overall though, this was a strong end to the trilogy, I can't deny that, but I did have some niggles with it that meant it wasn't my favourite of the three. For some more fantasy, we get on to The Obelisk Gate by N.K. Jemisin. Now, Jemisin is one of my favourite modern fantasy writers. I think she is absolutely fantastic. Again, this was a continuation of a series, and again, it was not my favourite. I thought the 5th season was better. The plot and the reveals in this book just felt a bit more muted and constrained. It is still a fascinating world with amazing characters, and Jemisin's prose is so good. I cannot say enough positive things about that. But there is a lot of exposition in this book about how the magic particularly works. It's really interesting and very original for the fantasy genre, but it really does slow the plot down. I didn't feel like we had as many big plot revelations or quite as much character growth as the first book. I honestly don't know at this point whether the Origins, who use a kind of earth magic, are actually using magic or science, even though the word magic comes into use for the first time in this book. But it is such an interesting system. It's tied into a lot of history, into a lot of issues of prejudice and power. It is absolutely integral to the world Jemisin has created and to the plots taking place in these books. If you're a fantasy fan or honestly just a reader, I would recommend everything that Jemisin has written. The Obelisk Gate was not my favourite, as I said, but it was a great continuation of the trilogy and I can't wait to wrap it up. Now we're getting on to some YA. I haven't read a lot of YA recently, really over the last couple of years. But I've been interested in Wilder Girls by Rory Power ever since it came out. The cover and the description gave me very strong Jeff Vandermeer vibes, and that is always a good thing. It's about a group of girls at a boarding school on a remote island who become affected by a sort of disease called the tox, which does horrific things to their bodies. Now, there's a lot of body horror in this book, even for a YA, so if you're a bit squeamish about that sort of thing, you might not like this one. I found it fascinating but not overdone, so I was pleased about that. But this was a bit of a mixed bag for me. The concept was amazing. I also really enjoyed the writing and I found the characters very compelling. I didn't always like them, but I thought they were beautifully written and the way they'd reacted to the very strange and disturbing circumstances they found themselves in felt very real. But I couldn't help thinking, particularly in the second half of this book, that there were just too many plot holes. The resolution of the book was a bit too obvious for me and a bit too rushed. I think other reviewers also had this feeling that it just kind of ended without answering enough of the questions that the book had set up. I think as a result, this worked better as a literary character study than a mystery. I really liked the characters and the writing, as I said, but the scientific background and the mystery element fell kind of flat for me. And there was also a suggestion towards the second half of a sort of conspiracy going on in the background, which I just found completely unconvincing. But if you go into this one for the characters and the writing, I would still highly recommend it because there are lots of interesting ideas and character interactions, and that side of the book is pulled off really well. Next up, we have got We Are All the Same in the Dark by Julia Heaberlin. This is an adult mystery told in two halves with two different narrators. And I read this right after Wilder Girls, and the funny thing is I'm going to say some of the same things about both. Again, I really like the writing here. I found the characters very compelling, but I guessed the ending far too early on for me. I like a little bit more build up in my mysteries. I don't want to go into too much detail about the plot for risk of spoilers. As with most mysteries, it's better to go in not knowing too much. But again, this was a book where the literary side was more compelling than the mystery. And finally, we've got a bit more YA and a bit more mystery. And this was my absolute favourite read of the spring. This was Truly Devious by Maureen Johnson. It is about an unusual boarding high school in the mountains of New England. Our character is obsessed with true crime and wants to be a detective and goes to the school with the hope of solving a decades-old mystery. Again, I don't want to say too much of the plot because it's better going into this one blind. I liked so much about this book though. The characters felt so much like real teenagers, which is not something that all YA pulls off. And yet there still felt like a reasonable reason for this teenage main character to be looking into an unsolved crime, which is a tricky thing to pull off in a YA mystery. Another tricky thing it pulls off is I really wanted the main character to get together with a particular love interest, despite thinking that the love interest was sometimes a bit of a jerk. I think this just comes back to the fact that the characters felt like real believable teenagers, and teenagers are really good at being jerks. But I still wanted them to get together. What I will say here is there is a massive cliffhanger at the end of this book. It resolves very little. A few things are answered, both about a modern day crime and the historic mystery, but you are definitely left with more questions than answers by the end. I think there are now 4 books out in the series, so I'm going on to read the second one quite soon. I think if I had a year or 2 to wait between books, the cliffhanger would have annoyed me a lot more. This is my highest recommendation from all the books I read this spring though. It's fun, it's fast-paced, it's twisty, it's got characters I really liked and rooted for, and it also gave me that vibe that Hogwarts did the first time I read the Harry Potter books. This is a school I really wanted to go to. So there is my big spring wrap-up. Everything I've read since January. It hasn't been the best reading year for me, honestly, but I have read some fantastic books that I really wanted to tell you about. I would love to know your thoughts on any of these books. Please leave them in the comments below, or give me recommendations. Tell me what you have been reading over the last few months. I have definitely been enjoying lots of mysteries and lots of epic fantasy, and that's what I'm also still reading at the moment, so we'll have more of those to talk about next time. Until then, keep reading everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.